Chapter 10 of the Bonnot Gang by Richard Perry. Kings of the Road, Part 2. Arise, revolt, attack, expropriate, strike. Strike without pity, for there comes a point where revenge takes on the necessity and the awesomeness of justice and hastens its triumph. Luigi Galliani. Attack. After their failure to steal a car in Chateau, the gang decided on a change of tactics. As the bourgeoisie and car owners in particular were now even more security conscious, the illegalists planned to hijack a car on the open road and then proceed immediately to rob the bank that they had targeted. Afterwards, they would dump the car in a suburb and simply walk back into Paris, hopefully before the police even knew that the bank had been robbed. It was to be an almost guerrilla-style hit-and-run operation. In the Rue Ordinaire flat, the gang armed up. Everyone had a 9mm automatic Browning, and Andre Saudi was given charge of a Winchester repeating rifle, which he concealed under his outsized greatcoat. They split into two groups and took a suburban train out past Bercy and Charenton to Maison-Alfort, where they reunited and strolled down the road toward Villeneuve-Saint-Georges, scene of the massacre of demonstrators in 1908, and a long syndicalist stronghold. Bonnot knew this route well. They were on the main road to Lyon, Route Nationale 5, which in a few kilometers passed through the thick forest of Saint-Art, and which was where Bonnot was intending to stage the ambush the next morning. The previous November, he had been walking through the very same forest, although in the opposite direction, on a path that had led him toward a notoriety he had sought, as France's most wanted man. He had arrived in Paris desperately seeking allies, and had been fortunate enough to find some comrades to whom he was indispensable, but it was a dependence he did not like. If tomorrow they were at last successful, then he would go his own way. As they heard Villeneuve, they stopped for a rest on a small bridge spanning a brook that ran down to the Seine. It was a pleasant spring evening, and in the distance a group of drunken workers could be heard singing L'Internationale. Raymond and René went into local grocers to buy sweets and biscuits to curb the late evening appetite. Half an hour later they had entered the forest. Dusk had fallen. While Saudi, Valet, and Monnier bedded down for the night in a roadside hut, Raymond tried to make himself comfortable on a heap of sand and pebbles. Bonnot and Garnier nestled under their overcoats on the grass nearby. It was rather different from the country visits they used to go on from Romainville, only 9 months earlier. The days of those carefree Sunday outings with Louise, Edward, and Barrette had gone forever. They were awoken early by the cock-crow, but did not get up until the birds had started singing in earnest. It was an average spring morning, with a trace of fog in parts. The sun was having difficulty trying to break through the cloud. The gang were near the 25-kilometer stone, only a few hundred meters from the crossroads, where the notorious attack on the Courrier de Lyon had taken place in 1796. A gang of 5 had killed the 2 drivers, dumping their bodies by the roadside, and made off with all the money destined for Napoleon's army in Italy. 116 years later, a gang of 6 stood ready to carry out their own ambush. At 7 o'clock that Monday morning, a spanking new 18-horsepower luxury limousine left the Dion Bouton showroom on the Champs-Élysées, driven by one of the Marquis de Dion's chauffeurs. A young secretary beside the driver had been charged with making the 18,000-franc purchase for the Comte de Rouge, the colonel of dragoons who had ordered the charge at Villeneuve-Saint-Georges 4 years previously. He was now sunning himself at Cap Ferrat on the Côte d'Azur, which was the vehicle's destination. To get there, the chauffeur intended to take the usual route, the NS, which ran through the forest of Saint-Art. Hiding amongst the trees, Bonnot, Garnier, and Calaman watched the road, while the others stayed in the little cabin. A few workers, a cyclist, then a motor car passed by, the latter at some speed. They had to make sure the first car that they tried to stop did so, otherwise the police would be alerted. Fortunately, 2 horse and carts were coming down the road, so the 3 of them ran out and ordered the carters to block the road and not do anything foolish. Almost at the same instant, the noise of an approaching car became audible, and sure enough, a blue and yellow Dion Bouton came into view. The chauffeur had seen the signs warning of resurfacing work. So perhaps he thought that the man in the road before him waving his handkerchief meant to tell him that the road was up. As the car came to a halt, Garnier lowered his arm and walked forward, flanked by Bonnot and Calaman. Each of them had a Browning in their hand, and Raymond shouted out, "It's the car we want." Mathalet, the driver, made a fatal error. He pulled out his own gun, but Bonnot was too quick for him and shot him through the heart. Simultaneously, Garnier fired at the other man, hitting him 4 times in the hands, which he'd raised to try and protect himself. Valet, Monnier, and Saudi ran out from under the trees, while Garnier and Calaman dragged the bodies to the side of the road, and Bonnot turned the car around. As soon as the last of them had scrambled in, Bonnot put his foot down and the limousine accelerated away toward Paris. As they sped along, the chauffeur's accoutrements, a traveling bag, basket, and clothes were flung out of the window, while the curtains, drawn down, flapped madly about in the wind. Bonnot burst into song, and the others joined him, rousing renditions of Le Temps de Cerise and Gloire aux Soldats de 125E. They were enjoying a freedom of the road that few other workers could enjoy at that time. Normally, l'automobilism, which warranted its own column in the conservative daily Le Figaro, was an aesthetic pleasure reserved for the rich, even if anarchist sympathizers like Octave Mirbeau highly praised the feeling of individual freedom that it imparted. The gang skirted around Paris through the eastern suburbs as far as Saint-Denis, and then picked up the main road, the N16, which led north to the sleepy, unsuspecting little provincial town of Chantilly, where they intended to attack the Society General, the bank. That is, but also by so doing, society in general. It took Bonnot almost 2 hours to cover the 70 kilometers separating Senart from Chantilly. He cruised through the town and drew up right outside the bank in the main square. While he stayed at the wheel, Garnier led the assault on the bank, followed by Calaman, Valet, and Monnier. Saudi remained on the pavement with the Winchester raised. The bank clerks jumped up in surprise as the gang ran in, with Calaman shouting, "Monsieur, not a word." One of the clerks dived to the floor, noticing that Calaman was having difficulty drawing his pistol, which caused Garnier to shout, "Fire!" He pumped 6 bullets into the eldest cashier, while Calaman shot a 17-year-old clerk 4 times, and Valet hit the 16-year-old in the shoulder. A 4th man escaped by scrabbling out the back door, with bullets zipping past his head. Monnier stayed by the entrance. Garnier leapt over the counter and barked, "Take the money first." He didn't want them to end up with a pile of worthless bonds again. Finding a bunch of keys, they began rifling the safe. Outside, the noise of the shooting had attracted the attention of the locals, including the absent bank manager, who began to walk back across the square. Saudi shouted, hold it, or I'll pick you off," and then loosed off 4 rounds over the man's head, which convinced him to beat a hasty retreat. Saudi continued to fire over the head of every person who ventured into the square or showed themselves at a window, effectively keeping the local citizenry at bay. The others now ran out of the bank, guns blazing to cover their retreat, and threw themselves into the waiting car. Andre Saudi fired off a parting shot, then sprinted after the already moving car, passing the rifle in through the window, but slipping as he jumped onto the running board. The others managed to haul him inside, only to discover that he'd fainted in all the excitement. Calaman had cut himself on the broken glass of the track window, and was bandaging his hand with a handkerchief, while Garnier was still firing at a courageous if foolhardy pursuer, who soon fell, wounded in the foot. Another shot in the leg of a horse prevented a cart blocking their getaway. Within minutes they were clear of the town and racing south back toward Paris, at an even more breakneck pace. At Les Arches, 2 policemen alerted by a telephone call from Chantilly frantically attempted to pursue, one on a bicycle, the other on a horseback, but they were easily outpaced by the 18-horse-powered limousine. At 11 o'clock, the car was sighted at Épinay-sur-Seine. 20 minutes later, 2 police cyclists began to give chase in Asnières, but quickly lost the car from view, not far from the station. In the boulevard Paris, the gang abandoned their getaway vehicle, clambered over a fence, and made off for some waste ground alongside the railway line. They left bowler hats and overcoats in the car so as not to hinder their movement, and threw the rather conspicuous Winchester, wrapped inside a coat, into a hedge some distance further on. Inside the stolen limousine, the two policemen found, besides the hats and overcoats, a couple of blood-stained handkerchiefs, assorted 9mm and Winchester bullets, wallets and safe keys from the bank, and a few odds and ends belonging to the dead chauffeur, some tins of sardines, maps, and a pair of gloves. Seeing a slow-moving train heading for Paris, the police assumed that the gang had jumped aboard and dashed off to the local station, where the station master spent a frustrating 35 minutes trying to get a connection to the Surete. In fact, the gang had split into two groups of three and simply strolled across the bridge into Levallois-Perret, which just happened to be crawling with police and soldiers due to the fact that this municipality housed the consortium's main garage, as well as the striking taxi drivers' headquarters. The Bonnot gang walked right through the largest concentration of police in the whole of Paris and got clean away, with almost 50,000 francs in cash. State of siege. Bourgeois society, and the press in particular, now went hysterical over the drama of Chantilly. The guard on the gates and main railway stations of Paris were reinforced, and police on point duty were issued with revolvers, which they wore strapped outside their tunics. Police were also alerted on the frontier. All the main routes in France were in a state of siege, and a special watch was maintained over all the main banks. Prime Minister Poincaré convened a special cabinet meeting to discuss ways of strengthening police powers, and was then summoned to the Élysée Palace by President Fallières. It was agreed that the prefect of police, Louis Lapine, should be given carte blanche to take whatever measures he deemed necessary. Joanne, assistant chief of the Surete, was ordered to remain at his post, despite having requested a transfer due to his differences in method and character with Guichard. In the Chamber of Deputies, in reply to a question from M. Franklin Boulogne, deputy of Seine et Oise, the Minister of the Interior announced that a special police motorized unit was to be set up, and armed with rifles if necessary. The deputies were concerned that the police had been made to look foolish, equipped only with bicycles and old-fashioned cavalry revolvers, while the bandits had access to the fastest cars and the best weapons. There was an almost unanimous vote of an 8,000 franc supplementary credit to the Surete. The only 3 votes against were cast by 3 socialist deputies, Valiant, Colly, and Desjant. Lapine announced that the 200 extra men were to be drafted into the Surete over the next month, while the strength of the Parisian police force was to be increased by 600 a year, up to a total of 7,000. More importantly, a brigade criminelle was to be created, similar to Scotland Yard's flying squad, with 8 motor cars at its disposal and armed with automatic magazine-style pistols and repeating rifles. The same night as the Chantilly robbery, over 100 detectives went into action, raiding known anarchist addresses throughout the capital and the suburbs. Searches continued the next day and concentrated especially on the working-class areas in the north and east. The 27th, 28th, and 29th and 30th arrondissements. L'Anarchie was raided for the 3rd time. The Society General declared that in future its bodyguards would be armed, and upped the reward to a staggering 100,000 francs for anybody who gave information that led to the arrest of the robbers. Lastly, the government belatedly announced that the apparent precariousness of telephonic communications between Paris and the outlying suburban towns was to be investigated. None of these measures, however, managed to stem the tide of hysteria that gripped Paris and spread across the Nord and into Belgium. The sinister figure of the unidentified rifleman taking potshots at honest citizens was particularly disturbing. If this was the use workers made of the compulsory 2 years in the army, then heaven help the Republic. As it was, the number of draft dodgers had doubled over the last decade, and there were increasing discipline problems within the army, such that in the preceding year over 2,000 soldiers had been sent to the punishment battalions in Africa for anti-militarism, insubordination, or other such offenses, a 50% increase on the 1910 total. The new 3-year law might provoke mutiny amongst the conscripts. To counter the threat of armed working-class bandits, many bourgeois began to arm themselves. From dawn to dusk they queued up to buy guns and learn how to use them, while car owners, feeling particularly threatened, offered their vehicles to the police until such time as the bandits were caught. Cars were not yet widespread, and the idea that workers could not only have access to them, but make the particular use of them was very worrying. The hysteria did not let up. Virtually every break-in or murder was greeted by the hushed declaration, C'est encore un de la bande à Bonnot. The very night of the Chantilly raid, shots were reportedly fired at a car on a country road near Beauvoir, and in the days following, the gang were spotted in such diverse places as Chartres, Rennes, Arras, Calais, and Brussels, Charleroi, Béziers, and Marseille. Every day, hundreds of letters poured into the Surete disclosing the gang's latest supposed hiding place, but the police said they were only following up 20 leads. The press continued to report any incident which might possibly purport to show the mysterious movements of the Bonnot gang. On the Thursday, 3 of the gang were thought to have hailed a scab taxi in the Rue de Rivoli and take them to Saint-Germain-en-Laye. But when the driver stopped to telephone his wife, his passengers jumped out and transferred into a car containing 2 men and a woman, which had drawn up alongside and which proceeded to speed off. The fact that this sort of trivial and meaningless incident was reported at all shows both how great was the general hysteria and also how determined were the press to sell papers using the gang's spectacular image. In another incident, a Belgian station master fired on innocent travelers, thinking that they were the bandits, while in Paris, one Jules Bonnot surrendered himself to the police and was put in a mental hospital. All in all, such a panic amongst the bourgeoisie had not been witnessed since the anarchist terror of the 1890s. But in the working-class neighborhoods, the young kids were cheerfully running around playing Bonnot gang rather than hopscotch or other such traditional games.